Hello sports fans, welcome to Spruce Sports Central. Today, we're going to be going over everything you need to know for the 2026 UFL season. So the UFL season kicks off this Friday between the Birmingham Stallions and the Louisville Kings, and we're going to be going over everything you need to know before Friday's game. So, we'll start off with arguably the biggest thing from this past offseason, and that is the UFL adding 3 new teams and disbanding 3 old teams. So the teams they disbanded and moved on from were the Memphis Showboats, the San Antonio Brahmas, and actually last year's runner-up, the Michigan Panthers. Although for the Panthers, that might be a temporary thing, because the UFL just doesn't have a place for them to play right now, because they decided it wasn't worth paying for Ford Field. So they might be back in the next couple years, once there's a soccer stadium that finishes getting built in Michigan. But for 2026, the Panthers will not be part of the league. Now, the 3 new teams are the Louisville Kings, the Columbus Aviators, and the Orlando Storm. Now, for the Louisville Kings, they're going to be coached by Chris Redman, and they'll play at Wynn Family Stadium in, obviously, Louisville, Kentucky. For the Aviators, they'll be coached by former Ohio State receiver Ted Ginn Jr., and they'll play at historic Crew Stadium, which used to be the home of the Columbus Crew. And finally, for the Orlando Storm, they'll be coached by former Battlehawks coach Anthony Becht, and they'll play at Inter & Co Stadium in Orlando, obviously. And on the topic of changing stadiums and coaches, we actually saw a couple of the existing teams switch what stadium they'll be playing at. As the Renegades, they will now be playing at Toyota Stadium in Frisco, Texas, which is another soccer stadium, and all the stadiums I've referenced so far are soccer stadiums. And another thing with the Renegades is they're now going to be known as the Dallas Renegades, which they were known as back in 2020, instead of the Arlington Renegades, which they were known as when spring football returned, and they returned to the XFL in 2023. So we've got the Dallas Renegades now playing at Toyota Stadium in Frisco. And another team also moving is the Houston franchise, and they're actually rebranding themselves as they're no longer the Houston Roughnecks, and they've now rebranded themselves as the Houston Gamblers, which is what the original USFL Houston team was back from the 1980s. So we have the Houston Gamblers, and they'll be playing at another soccer stadium in Shell Energy Stadium in Houston. And then on the topic of coaches, all but one team from last season that is coming to this year's league has the same returning coach, and that is the defending champs, the DC Defenders, who kept Shannon Harris as their coach after he led them to the championship last year. But all the other returning teams have a new coach. Now, obviously, I already talked about the coaches for the new teams, but as far as the coaches for the existing teams go, the Stallions coach is no longer Skip Holtz. He decided he didn't want to coach the Stallions anymore, and instead it will be former Alabama quarterback and even former Battlehawks quarterback A.J. McCarron. For the Renegades, Bob Stoops retired, and they'll be coached by Rick Neuheisel. The Gamblers, they're being coached by Kevin Solman, who was actually their coach back in 2022, and they weren't very good then, but they're giving him another chance. And then for the Battlehawks, they'll be coached by Ricky Prohl, after, obviously, their previous coach, Anthony Becht, was named head coach of the new team, the Orlando Storm. Now, you might be wondering who's playing on these new teams, and the UFL decided that by doing an expansion draft a few months ago. And I think that made a lot of sense, because instead of just assigning the 3 rosters of the teams that folded to the 3 new teams, they're giving each new team a chance to start fresh. And that makes a ton of sense, especially considering the Brahmas and the Showboats, 2 teams that folded after last season, were the 2 worst teams in the UFL last year, and they combined for 3 wins. So now you're giving these new franchises a fresh slate, fresh players, and you're also giving these fan bases hope, instead of just inheriting a roster that was terrible last season. Now, as far as what players are actually on each team, I'm not going to go really into much detail here at all, and I'm going to do a separate video later in the week on my full roster breakdown and predictions for the UFL season. So be sure to subscribe and turn notifications so you guys don't miss that. Now we move on to some rule changes, and the UFL made some really fun rule changes in the offseason. The first one is the addition of the 4-point field goal. So all field goals at least 60 yards will now be worth 4 points, and that's going to make things really interesting. The only thing with this rule is teams have to snap the ball your standard 7 to 8 yard distance, and you can't go snap the ball 15 yards to make it a 60-yard field goal and worth 4 points. So I'm definitely interested to see how teams utilize that as well. And if you're in a late game situation down by 3, you're going to go for a 55-yarder to tie, or you're going to kick a 60-yard field goal for the win. I'm definitely interested to see how teams approach that if they approach those situations. Another rule change is the UFL teams can no longer punt once they've crossed midfield, and that includes if they go backwards on the possession. So once you cross midfield, that's it. You can't punt on that possession. Then another one is they have banned the tush push, which is one the NFL has considered several times, and obviously a lot of people think the tush push should be banned. Now, obviously you can still run a quarterback sneak. The only change here is you can't have other players push the quarterback forward. But I definitely think that's a pretty solid move, considering the tush push is such a hard play to officiate. Another rule change is changing what a catch is. So now players in the UFL only need to get 1 foot down in bounds as opposed to 2. Now I think that's a fun rule and it's going to make things more interesting. We'll see more crazy catches, although I'm not the biggest fan of it because I do think professional football should require 2 feet down in bounds. And then moving on to rule changes we see on special teams, the first one is the extra point. So in the past few years, UFL teams have had the option to go for 1, 2, or 3, and they've had to run a scrimmage play from either the 2, 5, or 10, depending on what they were going for. Now the UFL has brought back the standard field goal, the PAT, worth 1 point, which will be a 33-yard field goal, and they'll still have the option to go for 2 or 3. And for a 2-point conversion, they'll snap the ball from the 2-yard line, and a 3-point conversion is actually in 2 yards from where it was last year, as it will now be snapped from the 8-yard line. And they've also tweaked the kickoff a little bit, so they're still using your standard NFL kickoff with how the 2 teams start 5 yards apart, which I've talked about before, I'm not the biggest fan of, but if the NFL is doing it, it makes a lot of sense for the UFL to do it. But they have tweaked it a little bit, as instead of kicking off from the 35, teams are now kicking off from the 30, and if the ball goes into the end zone on the fly for a touchback, the ball will be brought out to the 40 instead of the 35, which, again, I don't love. And then the final change the UFL made in the offseason was the standings, and they eliminated divisions, and now all teams are just grouped in one, I guess you can call it a division, but they're not all just grouped in one, and the top 4 teams will make the playoffs, instead of being top 2 from each division, which definitely makes a lot of sense, because now you're guaranteeing the top 4 teams in the league get into the playoffs, which wasn't a guarantee in the past. But that is everything you need to know before the UFL season opener this Friday. I'll have a lot of UFL content in the next few days. I'll be covering the UFL all year long and putting out weekly predictions and streaming for the UFL, so be sure to subscribe, turn notifications so you guys don't miss that. But that is everything you need to know for the 2026 UFL season. Thank you guys for watching. Be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn notifications. I do my best to post as often as possible, and I will see you in the next video.